So this next one, Streptococcus pyogenes, if we take that name apart, strepto means in chains, coccus spherical, pyogenes, that name pyo means pus, genes comes from genesis of, so pus producer. So if you take the name apart, it just means spherical clusters, spherical cocci that make pus. They are non-motile, so just like Staphylococcus aureus. They form capsules and they also form slime layers. They are facultative anaerobes, just like Staphylococcus aureus. They do ferment a variety of sugars, so we can kind of use sugar fermentation as phenotypic characteristics. But what we'll be using specifically in lab is their lack of ability to make catalase. Catalase test is a really easy test. You can easily tell a Staphylococci from a Streptococci because think they're both gram-positive cocci. They're often in the same location, so visually you can't tell them apart really. But through a quick catalase test, you could tell a Staphylococci from a Streptococci just by adding hydrogen peroxide to them. So we will do that in lab. Another key thing, or the way that even we speak about Streptococci, is by their type of hemolysis. So this picture is showing that sheep blood agar, so agar with 5% blood in it, and some microorganisms can secrete an exotoxin that lyses and breaks open the red blood cells, and then that organism gets to live off of the hemoglobin and the iron and all those other things inside that cell. So Streptococcus pyogenes is beta hemolytic, meaning completely lyse those red blood cells. The best thing to do is just string this together in your head. They're called Group A, and I'll explain what the Group A part is, beta hemolytic Streptococci. So Streptococcus pyogenes is a Group A beta hemolytic strep. They are also sensitive to bacitracin, which is another way we're going to use that in lab to identify them. They too cause a large range of diseases and infections. They do the same skin infections as Staphylococcus aureus, except we're going to add necrotizing fasciitis. So I'll explain that to you. If you've ever had strep throat, it was caused by Streptococcus pyogenes. There is a certain strain that kind of causes strep throat in a way, but then has some extra stuff to it, including a red rash, so scarlet fever. You can also get when somebody has a streptococcal infection, whether it is by skin or an upper respiratory, so in the pharynx or in the throat, post-streptococcal sequelae. So those complications after someone has an infection, so we'll talk about rheumatic fever, glomerulonephritis, and pandas. That's a lot of stuff that they cause, and just like Staphylococcus aureus, it's because they have a whole host of an arsenal of weapons. They can avoid phagocytosis, they produce enzymes, they have their own toxins, they also produce superantigens, and plus, what they have different from Staphylococcus aureus, their surface carbohydrates, their surface antigens, we get cross-reactivity with the antibodies that we make to fight that infection. Then we get cross-reactivity and damage to our body tissues. So that's the cause of that after an infection. Streptococcal sequelae. Sequelae means plural complications. Sequela would be singular. Some things that they have, so their surface, so their cell wall structure, they have polysaccharides that prevent them from the action of lysozyme. Lysozyme is one of those enzymes in our secretions, particularly saliva, that can break down the links between the peptidoglycans, so it can disrupt cell walls, and they're resistant to that. Lipoteichoic acids are part of the gram-positives, have those lipoteichoic acids, and theirs are very good for allowing them to stick to the epithelium in the throat. So they have those. They have an M protein which resists phagocytosis. To kind of remind you in a picture, it inactivates complement, and also it's the sticky protein, so they think it also helps them stick. And then high hyaluronic capsule also contributes to the stickiness as far as just helping them resist phagocytosis. We also react to their surface structures and cause that cytokine storm. So just kind of reminding you, I showed you this slide before, as far as weapons, we tag things that aren't us with complement, so C3b, and those act as opsonins. Staphylococcus aureus, Streptococcus pyogenes, and they can sort of inactivate. It's kind of like if they get stuck with complement, they just get off me. Nope, because they attach our complement deactivating protein. And remember, complement, we get opsonization, inflammation, and that membrane attack complex, so it just doesn't work. They also have both Staph aureus and Streptococcus pyogenes. Normally, antibodies target things for destruction, and that FC part was the stem part, that's what acts as the opsonin and activates complement. They have FC receptors on their surface, so they bind to the stem part. That's the part that's the flag that tells the immune system to destroy it. So like I said, they're very good at avoiding destruction by the immune system. Other things that it has, kind of the same thing that Staph aureus has. So DNases, they have high hyaluronic acid, so high hyaluronidase, that breaks down our ground substance. Proteases break down our proteins. Kinases break down blood clots, and that inflammatory response, a lot of times we try to build a clot with fibrin strands to contain them in a particular area, and so they can just break through with that. They have cytotoxins. They gave them names, streptolysin, so it lyses cells, O and S. Difference between those two, streptolysin O can't act in the presence of oxygen, but S can, so it's oxygen labile. They also make special toxins, exotoxins, unique to them. So pyrogenic exotoxin. Some books call it erythrogenic toxin. If you kind of remember it's either, it tells you what this toxin does. Erythro means red, so we're going to see some redness and some red rashes from this toxin. Pyro means fire, so also spikes in fever, so high fevers. This toxin is very similar to toxic shock syndrome toxin from Staphylococcus aureus. So it is a super antigen, and we get that dysregulated immune response and that cytokine storm. Only some strains, thankfully, carry this toxin, and it is the strains that are infected by a bacteriophage, so a bacteria that got a virus that gave it a gene. So part of that horizontal gene transfer, which I will flesh out more for that in Unit 5, but I'm just saying only some strains, thankfully, have this pyrogenic erythrogenic toxin. We classify streptococci based on their hemolysis on sheep blood agar, and Streptococcus pyogenes have very good hemolysins, so they can lyse the red blood cells. They are capable of beta hemolysis, so complete hemolysis, and that means they kill the cells and eat off the proteins and nutrients inside. They can also use these cytotoxins against other cells as well, so that's why you also see the pus involved, so they can kill white blood cells, they can kill other cells. The alpha hemolysis is partial hemolysis. When I talk about Streptococcus pneumoniae, it is capable of, there it is, alpha, like that doesn't look right. Alpha hemolysis, and then gamma hemolysis is no hemolysis. And like I said, we'll be looking at this slide in lab, and we're going to kind of go through our series of tests so we can tell gram-positive cocci in chains. So if we were to do a gram stain, then we could use biochemical testing to tell them apart. That's great, but there's still a whole lot of different types of streptococci. So there's a woman named Rebecca Lansfield, and she did her work early in the 20th century, and she came up with a grouping system using serology, so using antibodies looking at their surface antigens. And she gave them letters, so there's 80 different serotypes. Yes, I know you run out of letters. They got creative after that. Started off with letters, But types A, B, and D, these are pathogenic groupings. And so group A strep, you'll hear, oh, it's just a group B streptococcus infection. But Streptococcus pyogenes is beta hemolytic and in group A. It's most known for causing strep throat. So streptococcal pharyngitis, so your throat is your pharynx, itis just means inflammation. It is a respiratory disease, so usually by respiratory droplets and enter through the respiratory tract. Because of the cytotoxins, you often see these reddish little hemorrhages on the back of somebody's throat. The reservoir for Streptococcus pyogenes is going to be people. About 15% of people are carriers. It's higher in younger people than it is in older people. Most of the time, a sore throat is going to be caused by a virus, so strep throat isn't all that common. Like I said, it's mostly going to be in younger people. Difference, it is going to have a fever, usually is associated with strep throat. It's also more serious. It hurts way more because you've got these little hemorrhages back there. Another difference, if somebody has a sore throat and they're losing their voice, it's viral, usually. So you have more sore throats from viruses. Most patients, like I said, they're going to go hopefully get treatment, antibiotics, they will recover within about a week. And oral penicillin or penicillin-like class of antibiotics still works thus far. Certain strains have that bacteriophage infection, make that special toxin, erythrogenic toxin, which is that super antigen that dysregulates the immune system. So still have a sore throat, they'll have a high fever, but you also get this sandpaper rash, which is why it got its name scarlet fever. Just everything's red. Their skin was red, the back of the throat was red. This was historically a much larger problem. Very high mortality rate, so 95%. So think your grandparents or great-grandparents, they may have had it or definitely knew people that had it. Because of that streptococcal toxic shock syndrome toxin would cause death. Like I said, it's currently rare. They are having little outbreaks in the UK and parts of Asia, and they're watching that to see if that goes anywhere. But only certain strains that are carrying the erythrogenic toxin and the toxic shock syndrome toxin on from that phage infection. If somebody comes in and they suspect strep throat, they're going to use that rapid diagnostic test. So there's a rapid test that can be done in the doctor's office. This often has false negatives. It will still be sent off to pathology, and then they usually get the call like, yeah, you really do have it, or no, you don't. So confirming that. The problem with streptococcal infections is that those outer antigens mimic ours. So you want to treat strep throat, you want it to have the shortest course of time as possible, because you don't want a really strong response. That post-streptococcal sequelae happens 1 to 3 weeks after symptoms, and like I said, 1 to 3% of untreated Streptococcal pyogenes infections will have some sort of complications. The 3 types of complications, we've got rheumatic fever. So if I say rheumatic or rheumatoid, what do you think of?
Just because of
Yeah, I couldn't hear. What did you say?
Arthritis.
Yeah, spot on. Okay, so people got a fever, they were sick, and then they got achy, their joints hurt. And so that's how they named this, rheumatic fever. So it's 1 to 3 weeks after. And they believe that it is just due to that mimicry, that antibodies that were made for that infection, they're still circulating. And so now they bind to self tissues and target it for destruction. So we get inflammation and damage to joints, so someone feels achy and they feel bad. And then also it targets typically the heart. It can be other body tissues as well, but those are the 2 big ones that it goes to, and it can damage heart valves. In some cases, you get this rash, and so just think redness, yeah? Erythema marginatum, so erythema just means red. It has these weird margins, so it's pretty distinctive looking rash. Also in small children, more likely you get chorea, which is just twitchy, uncontrolled body movements, can also occur. As far as that heart valve damage, in rheumatic fever, heart valves, they are supposed to close tightly and prevent blood from backing up into the aorta. And if somebody has a leaky valve, like that doesn't go away with the disease. And so their heart is damaged. It doesn't show up till later in life. They have that leaky or incompetent valve and can lead to congestive heart failure. So we've got rheumatic fever, targeting cross-reactivity, targets joints and heart. Then you can also get glomerulonephritis, and the glomerulus is a little tiny capillary bed in the nephrons of the kidneys. So the nephrons, if you remember your AP2, filters blood and makes urine. So we have antigen-antibody complexes building up and targeting. We get inflammation in the kidneys and damage to that filtration membrane, so we end up with blood in the urine. Usually these are going to be children. They're going to be they'll have sort of a swollen appearance. But the big thing that's going to be the alert is the urine's going to look like iced tea. It's going to look very dark. So hemoglobinuria, if you remember your urine analysis, that's enough to go, get a mom to go, whoa, okay, that's not supposed to be like that. So glomerulonephritis. It's only some strains, so not all strains will cause this. And then the last one is pandas, which I'm glad they gave it a mnemonic. They really worked to get it to be something, but pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorder associated with streptococci. This is an abrupt onset or worsening of children. This actually happened to my son. He was in 6th grade. Didn't realize he had strep. Didn't know. It's one of those things, your kid comes home at the end of the day, doesn't feel great, my throat's a little scratchy, like, okay, rest for a little bit, never ran a fever. Next day, I feel fine, goes off, but kind of was going on for probably like a month and a half. Like, you'd have days, didn't say anything, like, oh, my throat kind of hurts. Go to bed, wake up feeling fine. You're like, okay, finally took him to the doctor and he had strep. Shortly after that, though, all of a sudden my child that was very easygoing and loved life got very anxious. And everything bothered him, from bumps in the socks to wrinkles in the sheets, and started obsessing over the bus driver. What if he had to go to the bathroom on the bus? And all of these things that all of a sudden crept up in my kid that never really was wired that way before, and turned out to be due to, they guessed, what's happening is the antibodies that were made against the infection are now attacking the basal ganglia in the brain and bringing on, it could also be ticks. He didn't have any ticks, but I'm just saying they are now, it's not a very, they're talking about it more now just because I think they're speaking more about mental illness and they're seeing that, but they're thinking it could be as high as 1 in 200 children, and it kind of goes undiagnosed, right? Because if somebody, well, that's just who you are, and that's just, let's just talk about that. And like, well, what happened, it's like, okay, did they have a streptococcal infection? Do they have one now? Like I said, because they're carriers, some people are carriers, and we'll talk about how you can be a carrier and also get a disease in the next slide. I have a nice slide in case you're kind of getting fuzzy on that. But that too is a post-streptococcal sequelae. So Streptococcus pyogenes, like Staphylococcus aureus, can cause abscesses, impetigo, and wound infections. Other things that Streptococcus pyogenes causes is necrotizing fasciitis. So we learned necrosis is cell death. So we've got tissue death occurring. These are only strains that have the erythrogenic exotoxin, so only ones that are infected by that virus that gave them this trait. They're flesh eaters. So you have a skin or wound infection. Usually it's going to be an opportunistic. Thankfully, it is very rare. So diabetes, HIV, cancer patients. But once it starts spreading, it can go really fast, like centimeters per hour, like really quickly. And the treatment is to debride, to get rid of that dead and decaying tissue. IV antibiotics, hope that it stops, and then amputation. Because once again, you don't want it going systemic, because then that would lead to death. Do you remember our buddy Ignaz? That seemed like a long time ago. So Ignaz, childhood fever or puerperal fever, they Of course, he never figured out why. We knew about the sad end. He did get people to sort of wash their hands. But this is infection from women giving birth. They were the ones, they had the med students that wouldn't wash their hands, and so they brought in Streptococcus pyogenes. And so they think it was Streptococcus pyogenes. Interestingly now, there are still women that get puerperal fever, and that just means spike in fever after delivering or through a C-section. So it's an infection of the genital tract just because it was open right through birth, and then the placenta detaches and you basically have this wound. And so it's an introduction of bacteria into the reproductive tract. And so it's Streptococcus pyogenes. They believe it was more, that's what, we don't know for sure, because shortly thereafter, that's what they determined. We're guessing. Other things that do it now, because it still happens, you can have Escherichia coli. There are other streptococci. We're going to talk about one, Agalacturia, and oh, I forgot my other one. Those are the three biggies. It'll come to me later. We still have Streptococcus pyogenes causing those issues. Strangely enough, usually that is when it is a vaginal delivery. If it happens when a woman is a C-section, it is usually going to be other bacteria. So from the skin. All right, so 3 leading causes of wound infections. Staphylococcus aureus, so number 1. In wound infections, just because it's already on the skin, so more likely to cause an infection. Streptococcus pyogenes is kind of everywhere. It's number 1 cause of flesh-eating necrotizing fasciitis. And then we'll hit Pseudomonas aeruginosa. We already kind of talked about that one when we discussed biofilms. It's also green. That seems to plague burn patients more than the other 2. All right. So we got our big ones. So Staphylococcus aureus, Streptococcus pyogenes. Next, as far as the streptococci goes, Streptococcus pneumoniae is the number 1 cause of community-acquired pneumonia and the number 1 cause of bacterial meningitis. We'll go through that. Kind of remind you, anything that gets to the lower respiratory tract, so the airways, so trachea, you've got your bronchi, your bronchioles, and then you have your air sacs, your alveoli. So any lower respiratory infection, usually there's inflammation, we're going to get coughing, fever, it's going to cause pneumonia. And so it can be, doesn't have to be Streptococcus pneumoniae, doesn't have to have pneumonia in the name to cause pneumonia. But this one is the number 1 cause of community-acquired pneumonia. Usually because there is an infection, you get inflammation, so you get excess fluid. And if there's fluid inside the air sacs, this is the respiratory membrane, so oxygen is supposed to diffuse into the blood, and our carbon dioxide waste gas goes in the alveoli, and we blow that off. If there's fluid in the lungs, that exchange doesn't happen, and so they're not going to get their oxygen, so that's how people end up dying of pneumonia. You put them on a ventilator, but the oxygen doesn't cross and get into the blood, and the carbon dioxide can't get out, then that can cause death. Lower respiratory too, tuberculosis also lower respiratory. With all of the pneumonias, usually you're going to see coughing, and then more than likely you're going to have fever as well, and because of that lack of gas exchange, pneumonias are always life-threatening. Yeah, so there's 3 different types, and I'm going to make them special for you so that you can remember, and we'll be hitting this again. But Streptococcus pneumoniae, also called pneumococcus, like I said, that is the number 1 cause of community-acquired, so just out in the public, pneumonia. Usually it's 50 or older, and normally when somebody has a lot of fluid in their lungs and they cough, there's going to be sputum involved, so they'll be coughing up sputum. And usually it's rust-colored, but we'll hit that later. All right, encapsulated, they have a capsule. This capsule, they kind of think is their main virulence factor because they know ones that don't have the capsule don't cause disease. So that is their number 1 virulence capsule. And they cause pneumococcal pneumonia. It is a respiratory disease, so it spreads through respiratory droplets. And like I said, these alveoli, the air sacs, they fill up with mucus, pus, blood. and someone's got difficulty breathing, and like I said, they'll be coughing up, it will be a productive cough. You can then take a sputum sample, take it to the lab, and they can look for microorganisms. Often when somebody comes in coughing, they're just going to do an x-ray. This fluid on an x-ray, so pneumonia shows up as white spots. Healthy lungs are clear, so it looks black on an x-ray. Humans are the reservoir. Once again, we've got carriers, so about 30% of people carry the encapsulated type of Streptococcus pneumoniae. It shows up in older people or people with lung disease. Big thing is most people, it just stays up here in the upper airways and it doesn't get down to the lower airways because of the mucociliary escalator. If that's not working, higher likelihood of developing pneumonia. Heart disease too, we see it in diabetes and cancer patients as well. It is in older people. There is a vaccine that is targeted when you're 50 and older. You can get a pneumococcal vaccine. There are antibiotic resistant strains, and so this is one of those serious threats by the Centers of Disease Control. So to treat broad spectrum and combination drug therapy. So a capsule is really the big virulence factor, so they can resist phagocytosis. They do make autolysins or cytotoxins that cause apoptosis of cells in the respiratory tract, and they even gave one acute name, pneumolysin O. So they do have some cytokines, but they don't have the big, huge arsenal like Streptococcus pyogenes or Staphylococcus aureus. They're the #1 cause of community-acquired bacterial meningitis as well. You can have respiratory infection, and it can get into the bloodstream and travel to the central nervous system. Normally, the central nervous system is protected by a blood-brain barrier, and they don't really know why, that some people, their blood-brain barrier gets breached, and they end up with meningitis. And coverings of the brain spinal cord of meninges. But yeah, high fever, headache, stiff neck, photophobia. Most of the time, it's going to go respiratory to the central nervous system. It can start off as meningitis, and then someone can get pneumonia as well. But about the people with meningitis, 1/4 of them have pneumonia. So it's just same organism, just depends where it is, what disease it's causing. Just kind of showing you it is alpha hemolytic, it has a capsule. All right, so this was the picture I was telling you about, because all of these things, I'm like, oh, these people are carriers, and these people get sick, and these people can die. So yes, the difference is on this strain. It depends where it is, whether it's causing pneumonia, if it's in the lungs, or if it's in the central nervous system, and it's causing meningitis. The other thing has to do with the balance of microbiota. They're there in carriers, but maybe not very high, right? Because there's other competing microorganisms there. Also, it has to do with the tolerance, and then, like I said, the strain, the damage. So think of people that are colonized, so over here on the right, they obviously aren't having a large inflammatory reaction to them, and that strain is not doing a lot of damage. Location, so from the respiratory tract, they can also go to the middle ear and cause ear infections. This mostly occurs in children, so young children. You don't see a lot of adults with ear infections. So most of them are going to be age 3 and younger. The younger they are, the more likely they're going to have an ear infection. Streptococcus pneumoniae, there's other ones, Haemophilus influenzae, and some other bacteria can do that. It starts off, kid has a cold, and then, a little bit later, then it starts bothering their ears. And that has to do with them traveling from the nasal cavity, nasopharynx, to the middle ear through the eustachians or auditory tubes. Little kids have cute round faces, and their auditory tubes are short, and then when we get older, our face elongates and those tubes get longer, so less likelihood of bacteria going from the nasal cavity or nasopharynx up to the middle ear. Other things too, kids sleep a whole lot more than we do. So just think about just gravity, right? If you're laying down more, higher likelihood of spread. If it's in the lower respiratory, you get pneumonia. If it goes systemic, it's sepsis, so liver, spleen. It can also go to meningitis. So it just it only crosses the blood-brain barrier in some people. So like I said, that's just going to be a difference between the host. So it just kind of depends overall immune states. Just kind of, I like this picture because it kind of says, well, how come some people are carriers and other people end up in meningitis? And so that's going to be the difference between strain and people. All right, so we've got Streptococcus pyogenes, and this causes a whole lot of things, right? And then we've got Streptococcus pneumoniae, number one cause of pneumonia. Pneumonia is in the name, usually older people, number one cause of community-acquired bacterial meningitis. And then the last streptococci, for the most part, I give a little shout out to Streptococcus mutans in lab. Streptococcus agalactiae, I always said it wrong, by the way, but figured it out. So agalactiae means without milk because it also infects cattle and stops milk production. It is the number one cause of neonatal or newborn meningitis. So this is something that would be vertically transmitted through the birthing process. If a woman in the United States is getting good prenatal health care and they're going to a place that they're doing everything they're supposed to, women are supposed to be screened to see if they are carriers. This colonizes about 10 to 40% of women as their normal microbiota. And so if a woman tests positive, they give her antibiotics during labor, and that is really cutting down on the amount of neonatal meningitis. Neonatal meningitis has a high mortality rate even with treatment. And so like I said, we started screening mothers, and so our counts have gone way down. Like I said, the problem is it goes it can go to the central nervous system, or it can cause sepsis, or you end up with both. I don't want you to think that's the only cause of neonatal meningitis. There can also be Escherichia coli, and this was usually this one if the baby is premature. And then neonatal meningitis. Anyone have a baby last year? Looking for formula? You guys heard that there was a formula shortage? Okay, just other things can cause neonatal meningitis, and that's how they figured out that some formula was contaminated with Prokaryotes. You have to know this one, it's not in your notes, but just it's in the news, and it just popped up again on the news that they're now looking for this and going into formula plants to make sure that they are adhering to strict sanitation. But Prokaryotes sakazaki, like I said, it's environmental. It's a gram-negative rod. I realize it doesn't fit in, but they realized there was an uptick in neonatal meningitis or infant meningitis, and so that's what sort of tipped them off. Going, it's not that way. What's happening? We're having more cases, and so they traced it back through epidemiology to a couple of the plants that were making formula. This also can happen just if somebody's not cleaning their breast pump as well, just it's in the environment. It is really good at living in powdery things. I think they've also had with tea, like powdered drinks and tea. So just for hygiene. So it is also now, it's on the radar of the CDC. If you're interested, that's there.